Shadows in the park. Ezra Monroe sat quietly on his favorite bench, overlooking the tranquil pond in the park. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting warm, amber light over the rippling water. Ducks glided effortlessly, and the faint laughter of children playing nearby mingled with the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Ezra adjusted his flat cap, pulling it down slightly to shield his eyes from the sun. His hands rested on his knees, gnarled but strong, carrying the history of a life lived with determination. At 70 years old, Ezra had seen more than his share of life's battles. Once a rising star in the boxing world, he traded the roar of the crowd for the simpler joys of running a modest hot dog cart. The streets of his city were his domain, a place where he shared wisdom, laughter, and his signature sausages with a community that adored him. Retirement wasn't easy, but Ezra found solace in knowing he still made a difference. But that day in the park, Ezra felt a disturbance in the air. Laughter, harsh and cruel, cut through the stillness, jarring him out of his thoughts. He turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted a group of 4 men entering the park. Their presence was commanding, but not in a good way. They walked with an air of arrogance, their voices loud enough to disrupt the peace. At their helm was Clint "Bulldog" Hayes, a towering man with a tattooed neck and an expression that screamed trouble. Flanking Bulldog were his usual accomplices, Danny "Patch" Brooks, a wiry man who never seemed to stop moving, Vic, a cocky younger member with an aggressive swagger, and Ronnie, the youngest, whose grin didn't quite hide the nervous energy in his step. Ezra had seen men like them before. Predators, bullies, thriving on fear and intimidation. His body tensed instinctively, a fighter's instinct honed over decades. As the gang moved closer, Ezra didn't shift. He remained seated, his eyes calmly tracking their movements. The golden light of the setting sun painted long shadows across the park, stretching toward him as if to foreshadow what was coming. "Nice day for a stroll, ain't it, old man?" Bulldog called out, his voice heavy with mockery. His companions chuckled, feeding off his energy. Ezra tilted his head slightly, studying them. "Depends on who's strolling," he replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. Patch smirked, nudging Vic. "Hear that? The old man's got jokes." The gang closed in, their boots crunching against the gravel path. Ezra didn't move, though his sharp eyes flicked to each man in turn, noting their postures, their stances, the way they carried themselves. Bulldog loomed over him, a sneer plastered across his face. "You got some nerve sitting out here like you own the place," Bulldog said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe it's time you learned to share." Ezra raised an eyebrow, his hands still resting calmly on his knees. "And what exactly am I supposed to share?" Bulldog's sneer deepened. "Your wallet, your watch, whatever you got. We'll make sure you don't have to carry all that weight anymore." Ezra sighed, shaking his head. He adjusted his cap, his mind flashing back to the countless fights he'd faced, some in the ring, others in the streets. "Boys," he said quietly, "you've got the wrong man." Vic stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You gonna make this hard, old-timer?" Ezra's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Walk away," he said simply, "while you still can." The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Vic lunged forward, aiming to grab Ezra by the collar, but the old man moved faster than anyone expected. Decades of training came alive in a blur of motion. Ezra's left arm deflected Vic's grab, and his right fist delivered a quick, precise blow to the younger man's stomach. Vic doubled over, gasping for air as he stumbled back. "What the?" Ronnie stammered, his cocky grin evaporating. Ezra rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his frame straight and imposing. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, but the strength, precision, and discipline remained. "I warned you," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Bulldog's expression darkened. "You're gonna regret that," he growled. Ezra tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "We'll see." As Bulldog and his gang tightened their circle, Ezra's stance shifted, his feet planting firmly on the ground. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hidden fighter. The tension in the park was suffocating, the air crackling with a mix of adrenaline and unease. Ezra stood, his body a coiled spring of muscle and instinct honed from decades of discipline. Across from him, Bulldog squared his massive shoulders, flexing his fists like sledgehammers. Behind Bulldog, Patch and Ronnie hovered, their confidence shaken but not gone. Vic was still on the ground, clutching his stomach and gasping for breath. "You've got guts, old man," Bulldog snarled, his voice low and threatening. "But guts only get you so far. Let's see how tough you are when we're done with you." Ezra said nothing. His silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. He let the moment hang, waiting for Bulldog to make the first move. The gang leader obliged, stepping forward with a cocky swagger and swinging a wild haymaker aimed at Ezra's head. Years of training kicked in. Ezra sidestepped the punch with ease, his feet gliding smoothly over the gravel path. Bulldog's momentum carried him forward, leaving his side exposed. Ezra capitalized instantly, landing a sharp jab to Bulldog's ribs. The sound of the impact was a dull thud, enough to make Bulldog grunt and stagger back. Patch rushed in next, his wiry frame darting to Ezra's left. He swung his fist high, aiming for Ezra's temple, but the older man ducked low, twisting his body with the fluidity of a dancer. As Patch stumbled past, Ezra delivered a quick uppercut to his chin, sending him reeling. 2 down, Ezra muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to Ronnie, who now stood frozen in place. "Don't just stand there, idiot. Get him." Bulldog barked at Ronnie, who flinched but obeyed. The youngest of the gang lunged forward, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. Ezra caught him by the wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply. Ronnie cried out, dropping to his knees as Ezra released him with a shove. Bulldog growled in frustration, his patience snapping. Enough of this crap. He barreled toward Ezra, his massive arms outstretched like a bull charging its target. This time, Ezra didn't dodge. He stepped into Bulldog's path, bracing himself and delivering a powerful cross punch to the man's jaw. The impact was like a thunderclap, and Bulldog's head snapped back. He stumbled but didn't fall. For a moment, the gang leader and the retired boxer stood face to face, locked in a silent battle of wills. Ezra's breathing was steady, while Bulldog's was ragged, each exhale laced with fury. "You're tougher than you look," Bulldog admitted, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "But you're still just an old man." Ezra allowed himself a small smile. An old man who knows how to finish a fight. Before Bulldog could react, Ezra stepped forward, feinting with his left before delivering a devastating right hook to Bulldog's temple. The big man staggered, his legs wobbling beneath him like a felled tree. He collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, groaning in pain. Ezra straightened, adjusting his cap as he turned to face the remaining gang members. Patch helped Ronnie to his feet, both of them too rattled to continue the fight. They exchanged panicked glances before turning and bolting out of the park, leaving Bulldog groaning on the ground and Vic still trying to recover. As the adrenaline ebbed, Ezra felt the weight of his years settle into his joints. He glanced around and noticed a small crowd had gathered. A mix of joggers, dog walkers, and park regulars drawn by the commotion. They stared at him in awe, some murmuring among themselves, others pulling out their phones to record the aftermath. "Ezra, are you okay?" A young woman called out, stepping forward. It was Camille, a college student who often bought hot dogs from his cart. Ezra nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Camille. Just a little workout." Before Camille could respond, the distant wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The crowd parted as 2 police cruisers screeched to a stop near the park entrance. Officers poured out, their hands on their holsters as they approached the scene cautiously. "What's going on here?" one of the officers demanded, his sharp gaze flicking between the fallen bulldog and the composed Ezra. "Self-defense," Ezra said simply, gesturing to the gang leader groaning at his feet. He and his boys thought I was an easy target. One of the officers, a young man with a clean-shaven face, frowned as he recognized Bulldog. "Hayes," he muttered, "we've been after you for weeks. Looks like you picked the wrong fight." As the officers cuffed Bulldog and helped Vic to his feet, Ezra watched silently, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about a fight in the park. Bulldog and his crew weren't acting randomly. They were targeting people deliberately, creating fear and chaos in the neighborhood. Ezra had seen the signs before, subtle at first, but growing louder with each new incident. The question wasn't just why Bulldog was here today, but who had sent him. Later that evening, Ezra sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea as he replayed the day's events in his mind. The fight had been a physical reminder of his age, but also of his resilience. His body ached, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just an old man sitting idly by. He was a fighter, and his neighborhood needed him now more than ever. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ezra rose slowly, his muscles protesting, and opened the door to find Camille standing on his stoop, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Ezra," she began, her voice steady, "I know you're used to handling things on your own, but you can't do this alone. Bulldog's gang, they're not just punks. They're connected to something bigger. People are scared. And we need someone like you to lead us." Ezra studied her for a moment, her words sinking in. He thought of the faces in the park, the silent witnesses to his fight, and the weight of their expectations. Camille was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the community, about standing up to the darkness threatening to consume them. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "We'll fight back. Together." Camille smiled, relief washing over her features. "Then let's start by finding out who's really behind all this." As she left, Ezra closed the door and returned to his tea, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't just an old man defending himself in a park. He was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the face of hate, strength and unity could prevail. The fight was far from over. Secrets in the shadows. The neighborhood hummed with its usual rhythm the next morning, but beneath the surface, tension rippled like an undercurrent. Ezra Monroe was back at his hot dog cart, his hands deftly assembling sandwiches while the rich aroma of grilled onions and sausages wafted through the air. He greeted his regulars with his usual warmth, but his mind was far from the simple transactions of the day. The events of the previous afternoon replayed in his head, each moment sharpening his determination to uncover the truth behind Bulldog and his crew. The community buzzed with rumors about the fight in the park. Word spread quickly, how an elderly black man had stood his ground against a notorious gang. But it wasn't the fight itself that lingered in Ezra's thoughts. It was Bulldog's confidence, his sneering threats, and the way he seemed to act not as a lone wolf, but as part of something larger. Ezra had learned to trust his instincts, and they told him this wasn't over. As the lunch rush waned, Camille appeared, her determined expression matching Ezra's own. She clutched a notebook in one hand and a folder in the other. "Ezra, we need to talk," she said, glancing around nervously. Ezra nodded and gestured toward a small table set up beside his cart. Camille sat down, spreading the contents of her folder across the table. Newspaper clippings, photocopied documents, and handwritten notes covered the surface. "I've been digging," she began, her voice low. "Bulldog's gang. They're not just running around causing trouble for kicks. They've been targeting specific businesses and residents. It's deliberate." Ezra frowned, leaning in to study the clippings. "Deliberate how?" "Look at this," Camille said, pointing to a series of headlines. "Vandalism forces local grocery store to close. Family-owned pharmacy shutters after repeated break-ins. Arson destroys community center." She paused, her voice tinged with frustration. Every one of these places was hit just before someone bought up the property. Guess who? Ezra's eyes narrowed as he read the name scrawled in bold letters across one of the documents. Hendrick Development Group. Raymond Hendrick, Camille continued. Big-time developer. He's been buying up properties in this neighborhood for years, but it's always the same pattern. First, there's chaos, vandalism, violence, intimidation. Then, the owners sell cheap, and Hendrick swoops in. Ezra's jaw tightened. So, Bulldog's crew is just the muscle. Camille nodded. Exactly. Hendrick's using them to clear out the area so he can expand his empire. It's gentrification, Ezra, but with a sinister twist. Ezra leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about the elderly man who'd been shoved near the grocery store, the flower shop owner whose business had been trashed, and the young mechanic who'd spoken about slashed tires. It all fit. This isn't just about me, Ezra said, his voice heavy with realization. This is about the whole neighborhood. Camille reached across the table, her eyes locking with Ezra's. That's why we need to fight back. But we can't do it alone. We need evidence, something solid that ties Hendrick to Bulldog's gang. Ezra nodded slowly. I might know someone who can help. Later that evening, Ezra found himself walking down a narrow alley, the dim glow of a streetlight casting long shadows on the brick walls. He stopped in front of a worn metal door and knocked 3 times. The door creaked open, revealing a young man with nervous eyes. Ronnie, the youngest member of Bulldog's gang. Ronnie stepped back, his expression wary. What do you want, old man? To talk, Ezra said simply. I know you're smarter than the rest of them, Ronnie. You don't belong with Bulldog. Ronnie hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. You don't know anything about me. I know you didn't want to be there yesterday, Ezra replied, his voice steady. You hesitated. You're not like Bulldog or Patch. You've got a choice, Ronnie. You can help me, or you can let Hendrick chew you up and spit you out. Ronnie's eyes darted to the ground, his shoulders slumping. You don't get it. Hendrick's people. They're powerful. If I talk, they'll come after me. Ezra stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you don't talk, they'll keep using you until you're no longer useful. Then what? You think Bulldog's gonna protect you? Think again. The young man swallowed hard, fear flickering in his eyes. What do you want to know? Everything, Ezra said. How does Hendrick run his operation? Where's the money coming from? And what's his next move? Ronnie sighed, running a hand through his hair. Hendrick pays Bulldog through a shell company. It's all under the table, disguised as community outreach. They've got plans to hit the community center next, scare people off so they can redevelop the block. Ezra's fists clenched at his sides. When? Tomorrow night, Ronnie said. They're planning something big. I don't know all the details, but Bulldog said it's supposed to send a message. Ezra nodded, his mind already working. Thank you, Ronnie. You've done the right thing. Ronnie looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What happens now? Now, Ezra said, we fight back. The next morning, Ezra gathered a small group of trusted neighbors at the community center. Camille stood at his side, her notebook in hand, as they addressed the concerned crowd. Business owners, parents, and residents of all ages filled the room, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Ezra raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. Hendrick and his gang think they can scare us into leaving. They think they can take what's ours and get away with it, but they've underestimated us. This neighborhood is more than just a place. It's our home. Camille stepped forward, holding up the evidence she'd compiled. We've got proof. We know how they're operating, and we know what they're planning. But we need to stand together. If we're united, they can't break us. The crowd erupted into applause, their fear giving way to resolve. As Ezra looked out at the faces before him, he felt a surge of pride. This was the fight of his life, not in a ring, but in the heart of his community, and he wasn't about to back down. The battle was just beginning. Rallying the community. The energy in the community center was electric. The hum of conversation filled the room as neighbors huddled in small groups, their voices laced with a mix of anxiety and determination. Ezra Monroe stood at the front, his commanding presence drawing every eye in the room. He was no longer just the quiet man running a hot dog cart. He was a leader, a symbol of resilience in a neighborhood under siege. Camille stepped up beside him, her notebook tucked under her arm. She gestured for the crowd to quiet down, and the room quickly fell into a tense silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "We know why we're here. For too long, we've been living under the shadow of fear, vandalism, threats, and violence driving our neighbors away. But now, we know who's behind it." She held up a folder, the pages inside brimming with evidence. "Raymond Hendrick is pulling the strings. He's using Bulldog and his gang to clear out our community, one block at a time, so he can buy up properties and turn them into overpriced developments." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged knowing glances, their suspicions finally confirmed. A middle-aged man in the back, owner of the corner grocery store, raised his hand. "And what are we supposed to do about it?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've gone to the police before, but nothing ever changes." Ezra stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This time is different. We have proof. Real evidence that ties Hendrick to Bulldog's crew. But we need more than just facts. We need action. Together." A young woman near the front, holding a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "What kind of action?" "I can't fight gangsters." Ezra softened his tone, nodding toward her. "No one's asking you to fight, but standing together, refusing to be intimidated, that's its own kind of battle. Tonight, we show them that we're not going anywhere." Camille jumped in. "The community center is their next target. We know they're planning something tonight to scare us into giving up this space. But if we stand our ground, if we're here in numbers, they'll think twice." The room grew quiet as the weight of her words sank in. For a moment, doubt flickered in the eyes of the crowd. Then a voice called out from the back, "I'm in." It was an elderly woman, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun. She leaned on a cane but stood tall, her resolve shining through. "They've taken enough from us. I'm not letting them take this too." One by one, others began to speak up. "I'll be here." "So will I." "They can't scare us all." The momentum grew, and soon the room was filled with a collective determination. Ezra felt a swell of pride as he looked around, seeing his neighbors transform from frightened individuals into a united front. "All right," he said, raising his voice to command the room's attention. "We'll meet here tonight. Spread the word. The more people we have, the stronger we'll be." As the meeting broke up, people lingered in small groups, sharing ideas and offering support. Camille approached Ezra, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You think this will work?" she asked quietly. Ezra met her gaze, his eyes steady. "It has to." That evening, the community center was alive with activity. Families arrived in clusters, carrying chairs, snacks, and even board games to pass the time. Kids played in one corner while adults huddled together, whispering plans and offering words of encouragement. Ezra stood near the entrance, greeting each person as they arrived. The turnout was larger than he'd hoped. At least 50 people had come, filling the room with their presence. He could feel their nervous energy, but he also saw their determination. Camille sat at a table near the back, her laptop open as she monitored social media and local police reports. "No sign of Bulldog or his crew yet," she reported. Ezra nodded, his eyes scanning the room. He knew this wasn't just about numbers. It was about showing strength, resilience, and unity in the face of intimidation. As the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted. Laughter and conversation replaced the initial tension, and for a moment, It felt like a neighborhood block party. But Ezra's instincts kept him on edge. He knew Bulldog wouldn't back down easily. Just after 10 p.m., the sound of engines revving echoed outside. The room fell silent, every head turning toward the windows. Ezra moved to the front, gesturing for everyone to stay calm. "Remember why we're here," he said firmly. "We stand together." The engines grew louder, and then the squeal of tires pierced the night. A series of loud thuds followed as something heavy hit the building's outer walls. Bricks or rocks, Ezra guessed. The crowd inside tensed, but no one moved to leave. Through the window, Ezra saw Bulldog's black sedan parked near the curb. Several figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoodies. Patch and Ronnie were among them, though Ronnie hung back, his posture hesitant. Bulldog stepped forward, his voice booming. "You think you can defy me? This place isn't yours anymore." Ezra opened the door, stepping out onto the front steps. Behind him, the crowd remained inside, their presence visible through the windows. "This neighborhood belongs to its people," Ezra called out, his voice calm but unyielding. "You don't scare us." Bulldog laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're just an old man with a bunch of scared sheep. Step aside, or we'll tear this place apart." Ezra stood his ground, his gaze locked on Bulldog. "You want to fight? Then fight me. Leave everyone else out of it." Bulldog hesitated, glancing at his crew. For a moment, the balance of power shifted. Then the faint sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension. Bulldog's expression darkened. "This isn't over," he growled, retreating to his car. "You'll regret this." As the gang drove off, the crowd inside erupted in cheers. Ezra turned back to them, his expression softening. "You did it," Camille said, stepping beside him. "You stood up to them." Ezra nodded, but his mind was already racing. Bulldog might have backed down tonight, but Hendrik was still out there, pulling the strings. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The unraveling web. The morning after the standoff at the community center, the neighborhood buzzed with renewed energy. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, filling the streets with an undercurrent of both hope and trepidation. For the first time in months, people felt like they had a fighting chance against the forces threatening to uproot their lives. Ezra Munro, however, was far from celebratory. He stood behind his hot dog cart, handing out sausages with practiced ease, but his mind churned with plans. Bulldog and his crew might have retreated, but the storm wasn't over. Hendrik, the puppet master pulling the strings, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The sound of footsteps approaching his cart pulled Ezra from his thoughts. It was Camille, her face set with determination. She carried her ever-present notebook and a tablet tucked under her arm. "Ezra," she began, her voice low, "we need to talk." He gestured toward the folding chairs he kept nearby for regular customers. "What's on your mind?" Camille sat, opening her tablet and flipping to a series of photos and documents. "I stayed up all night digging into Hendrik's operations. This man has his fingerprints on everything. Real estate, construction, even local politics. And it's not just our neighborhood. He's doing this across the city." Ezra frowned, leaning closer to examine the screen. "You're saying this is bigger than we thought?" Camille nodded, her eyes flickering with anger. "Way bigger. Every time a neighborhood gets revitalized, it's the same story. Intimidation, harassment, and then a sudden influx of cash as properties sell below market value. Hendrik's got gangs like Bulldog's doing his dirty work, and he's hiding it all behind shell companies and fake community programs." Ezra absorbed her words in silence, his jaw tightening. "What's our next move?" "That's the thing," Camille said, hesitating. "We need something concrete, something that ties Hendrik directly to the gang's activities. Otherwise, he'll just claim ignorance, and the courts will let him walk." Ezra straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Then we find that something." By midday, Ezra and Camille were joined by Officer Logan Hart at the precinct. Hart, a tall, no-nonsense cop with a reputation for playing by the book, had been following the developments closely. He sat across from them in the station's small conference room, reviewing Camille's findings. "This is solid work," Hart admitted, gesturing to the documents spread before him. "But she's right. Without a smoking gun, Hendrik's lawyers will shred this in court." Camille crossed her arms, frustration etched on her face. "So what do we do? Just let him keep ruining lives?" Hart shook his head. "Not if I can help it. We've been monitoring Bulldog and his crew for months, but with your intel, we've got enough to justify a deeper investigation. If we can catch Bulldog or someone in his gang with evidence linking them to Hendrik, we've got him." Ezra leaned forward, his voice steady. "And how do we do that?" Hart hesitated, his eyes flicking between them. "We need to turn someone in his crew. Someone close enough to know Hendrik's operations." Ezra's mind immediately went to Ronnie. The young man had shown cracks in his loyalty during their last encounter, and Ezra sensed he might be willing to talk. "I might know someone," Ezra said finally, "but he's scared. He won't come forward unless he knows he's protected." Hart nodded. "If he cooperates, I'll make sure he's safe." Camille interjected. "And what about tonight? Bulldog's threats weren't empty. They'll try again." Hart leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "We'll have officers stationed near the community center, but we can't babysit the neighborhood forever. This has to end with Hendrik." Ezra's voice hardened. "Then we'd better make sure it does." That evening, Ezra found himself standing outside a rundown apartment building on the edge of the neighborhood. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the sky threatening a storm. He knocked on the door of Ronnie's apartment, his knuckles rapping against the wood with deliberate force. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Ronnie stood in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Ezra said firmly. "Can I come in?" Ronnie hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing Ezra into the cramped space. The apartment was sparse, with peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture. It was clear Ronnie lived a hard life, one shaped by desperation and bad decisions. "You shouldn't be here," Ronnie said, wringing his hands. "If Bulldog finds out—" "Bulldog's not the one I'm after," Ezra interrupted. "Hendrik is." Ronnie froze, his face paling. "Hendrik? You don't mess with him. He's got connections, power. People who cross him, they disappear." Ezra's gaze bore into him. "And what about you? You think Bulldog or Hendrik cares what happens to you? You're just another pawn in their game, Ronnie. But you can change that. You can help us stop them." The young man sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "What do you want from me?" "Information," Ezra said. "Details about how Hendrik runs his operation, where the money's coming from, how it's being funneled, and what they've got planned next." Ronnie hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "If I talk, they'll kill me." "We'll protect you," Ezra promised. "But you have to trust me." After a long silence, Ronnie nodded. "All right, I'll tell you everything." By midnight, Ezra and Camille were back at the precinct, where Ronnie gave a full statement to Hart. His testimony was damning, detailing how Hendrik funneled money through fake charities and shell companies to fund Bulldog's crew. He also revealed that Bulldog was planning another attack, this time on a block of small businesses. "This is the break we needed," Hart said, his voice tinged with satisfaction as he reviewed Ronnie's statement. "We can move on Hendrik." Ezra, however, wasn't satisfied. "And Bulldog?" Hart met his gaze. "We'll take them both down." Camille's voice cut in. "We need to act fast. Hendrik's smart. If he gets wind of this, he'll cover his tracks." Hart nodded. "We're already preparing a warrant. By tomorrow, we'll have everything in place." Ezra leaned back, his fists clenched. He knew the fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, He felt they had a real shot at taking Hendrik down. The storm was coming, and Ezra was ready. Striking back. The following morning dawned heavy and gray, the sky shrouded in thick clouds that threatened rain. Ezra Monroe stood at his usual spot by the hot dog cart, though his mind wasn't on grilling sausages. His sharp eyes scanned the neighborhood, his ears tuned to every sound. Today wasn't just another day. It was the beginning of the end for Raymond Hendrik. The precinct had been a hive of activity the previous night. Officer Hart and his team worked tirelessly to finalize the warrant, gathering every shred of evidence they could muster. Ronnie's testimony had been the keystone, painting a detailed picture of Hendrik's sprawling operation. Camille had been instrumental in connecting the dots, her meticulous research linking Hendrik's shell companies to years of intimidation and gentrification schemes. Ezra knew the stakes were higher than ever. Hendrik wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight. He built his empire on fear and manipulation, and dismantling it would require more than just a piece of paper. It would take strategy, courage, and unshakable resolve. At the precinct, the air was thick with tension as Hart gathered his team in the conference room. A large map of the city was pinned to the wall, marked with red and blue pins representing Hendrik's known properties and Bulldog's operations. Camille stood beside Hart, her tablet in hand, ready to provide updates. "All right, listen up," Hart began, addressing the room. "We've got the warrant. Today, we hit Hendrik where it hurts, his office. We're seizing documents, computers, anything that ties him to Bulldog's crew and the harassment in this neighborhood. But make no mistake, this won't be easy. Hendrik's got connections, and he'll use every trick in the book to wriggle out of this." He turned to Ezra, who stood quietly at the back of the room. "Ezra, you've been the backbone of this operation. You've brought us the people, the stories, and the courage to fight back. But I need you to trust us to handle this part." Ezra nodded, his expression firm. "I trust you, Hart, but don't expect me to sit on the sidelines. If there's anything I can do, you let me know." Hart's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've already done more than most people would, Ezra. Let us finish the job." Camille added, "I'll be on the ground, documenting everything. The world needs to see what Hendrik's been doing, not just for the courts, but for the people he's hurt." Hart clapped his hands, drawing everyone's attention back. "Let's move." The team arrived at Hendrik's sleek office building just before noon. The modern structure stood like a fortress in the heart of downtown, its reflective glass windows shielding the corruption hidden inside. Ezra and Camille watched from a safe distance, their hearts pounding as police cruisers surrounded the building. Hart led the charge, his team filing into the lobby with precision. Hendrik's receptionist, a polished woman with a strained smile, rose from her desk as they approached. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked, her voice tight. Hart held up the warrant. "We're here to search the premises. Step aside." The receptionist hesitated, her gaze darting to a security guard nearby, but she didn't protest. Within minutes, the officers fanned out, moving methodically through the building. Computers were unplugged, filing cabinets emptied, and hard drives secured in evidence bags. Camille stood on the sidewalk across the street, her camera clicking furiously as she documented the raid. She knew the importance of this moment, not just for the case, but for the community that had been living in fear for so long. Inside the building, Hart's team hit the jackpot. In Hendrik's private office, they discovered a concealed safe hidden behind a wall panel. When it was opened, it revealed a trove of incriminating documents, ledgers detailing payments to Bulldog's crew, emails outlining intimidation tactics, and even a list of targeted properties marked for redevelopment. Hart stared at the contents, his jaw tightening. "We've got him." As the raid continued, Ezra remained vigilant, his instincts tingling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hendrik was too calculated to be caught completely off guard. Where was he? His answer came moments later when a sleek black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the building. Raymond Hendrik stepped out, flanked by two men in suits who radiated menace. He was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair slicked back and a confident smirk that belied the chaos unfolding inside his empire. Ezra's hands clenched into fists as he watched Hendrik stride toward the building. Camille noticed him too, her camera snapping furiously. "That's him," she whispered. Before Hendrik could reach the doors, Hart stepped out, blocking his path. "Mr. Hendrik," he said, his voice firm. "We have a warrant to search your premises. You're welcome to contact your lawyer, but right now you're not stepping foot inside." Hendrik's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "Officer Hart, is it? This is outrageous. I've done nothing wrong." Hart's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." As Hendrik retreated to his car, his expression darkened. Ezra knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Hendrik was cornered. But a man like him wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, back at the precinct, the evidence was laid out in full. Camille sat with Hart, helping to organize the mountain of documents and digital files. Every piece painted a clearer picture of Hendrik's operation, a sprawling network of corruption that had infiltrated every corner of the city. But it wasn't just about the facts. It was about the lives Hendrik had destroyed, the families displaced, the businesses ruined. And it was about the people who had stood together, refusing to be silenced. As the team worked late into the night, Ezra returned to his cart, setting up in the same spot he'd occupied for years. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, the tension of the day still lingering. But as the first few customers approached, their smiles and words of gratitude reminded him why he'd fought so hard. "You're a hero, Ezra," one woman said, her young son clutching her hand. "You've given us hope." Ezra shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just doing what needed to be done." As the night deepened, Ezra looked out at the streets he'd called home for decades. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were winning. Hendrik's empire was crumbling, and the community was stronger than ever. The storm was passing, and in its wake, a new dawn was beginning to rise. The turning point. The day after the raid, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. News of Hendrik's exposed operations had spread, and for the first time in years, the community felt like they had a fighting chance. Still, the air carried an undercurrent of unease. Hendrik might have been cornered, but Ezra knew men like him didn't surrender quietly. Ezra sat at his kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. Camille was across from him, her laptop open, and her fingers flying over the keyboard. A map of the neighborhood filled the screen, marked with pins and annotations detailing Hendrik's influence. Officer Hart called. Camille said without looking up. "They've got enough to bring charges against Hendrik. The evidence from the raid ties him directly to the gang's activities. Payments, emails, even handwritten notes. It's airtight." Ezra leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Then why does it feel like we're still missing something?" Camille glanced up, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Bulldog," Ezra said, his voice thoughtful. "He's still out there. Hendrik's downfall won't mean much if Bulldog and his crew keep running wild." Camille nodded slowly. "Hart's team is tracking them. But they're slippery. They've gone underground since the raid." Ezra's jaw tightened. They won't stay quiet for long. Men like Bulldog thrive on chaos. When they feel cornered, that's when they're most dangerous. Camille's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Her eyes widened. "It's Hart," she said, answering quickly. "What's going on?" Ezra watched as Camille's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "We'll be there," she said, hanging up. She turned to Ezra, her face pale. "There's been an incident," she said. "Bulldog's crew hit a small business on the edge of the neighborhood, broke windows, sprayed slurs, and left a message. This isn't over." Ezra stood, his fists clenching. "Then it's time to finish this." The precinct was a flurry of activity when Ezra and Camille arrived. Hart met them in the hallway, his face grim. "They're escalating," he said, leading them into a conference room. A series of photos were spread across the table, showing the aftermath of the gang's latest attack. Broken glass littered the sidewalk, and graffiti scrawled in bold red letters defaced the storefront. "Get out, or else." "They're trying to scare the neighborhood back into submission," Hart continued. "And it's working. People are already talking about leaving." Ezra shook his head. "We can't let that happen. What's your plan?" Hart hesitated, his frustration evident. "We've got officers patrolling, but we need to catch them in the act. Without Bulldog or his crew in custody, Hendrick's defense team will argue that he had no direct connection to the violence." Camille interjected. "What about Ronnie's testimony? And the evidence from the raid?" "It's good, but it's not enough to nail Hendrick for everything," Hart admitted. "If we can't tie him to ongoing criminal activity, he might walk." Ezra's voice was steady but firm. "Then we set a trap." Hart frowned. "What kind of trap?" That evening, Ezra stood in the dimly lit community center, surrounded by a small group of trusted neighbors. Camille and Hart were with him, finalizing the details of their plan. The goal was simple: draw Bulldog and his crew out into the open and catch them red-handed. "They'll come for this place," Ezra said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "It's the heart of the neighborhood. If they can take it, they'll think they've won." Hart nodded. "We'll have plainclothes officers stationed nearby. When Bulldog shows up, we'll move in. But Ezra, are you sure about this? You'll be the one drawing them out." Ezra met Hart's gaze without flinching. "This neighborhood has stood by me for years. Now it's my turn to stand by them." Camille placed a hand on Ezra's arm, her expression worried. "Just be careful, okay?" Ezra offered her a faint smile. "Always." The night was eerily quiet as Ezra stood in the community center, the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. He had arranged the room to look as though a meeting was in progress. Chairs in a circle, coffee cups on a table, and a projector set up in the corner. From the outside, it would appear bustling with activity. Ezra paced slowly, his ears tuned to every sound. He knew Bulldog would take the bait. The man's ego wouldn't let him back down after such a public challenge. All Ezra had to do was hold his ground. Just after midnight, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. Ezra peered through the window and saw 3 vehicles pulling up. Bulldog stepped out first, his massive frame illuminated by the headlights. Patch and Vic followed, along with 2 other men Ezra didn't recognize. "They're here," Ezra murmured into the small microphone clipped to his shirt. It connected directly to Hart and the officers stationed nearby. "Stay calm," Hart's voice crackled in his ear. "We're moving into position." Ezra stepped out onto the front steps, his presence drawing Bulldog's attention immediately. Well, Bulldog sneered, his voice booming. "Look who's still playing hero." Ezra crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. "You picked the wrong neighborhood, Bulldog. It's over." Bulldog laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You think a couple of cops and some paperwork scare me? I own this place." Ezra's voice didn't waver. "Not anymore." Bulldog signaled to his crew, and they began advancing. Ezra stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. Just as Bulldog reached the bottom of the steps, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Flashing lights flooded the street as officers swarmed the area. Hart emerged from the shadows, his gun drawn. "Freeze." Hands in the air. Bulldog's crew hesitated, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the overwhelming police presence. Bulldog himself clenched his fists, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled at Ezra. Ezra's gaze was steady. "Yes, it is." By dawn, the streets were quiet again, but the community was forever changed. Bulldog and his crew were in custody, and the evidence gathered during the operation solidified the case against Hendrick. Camille's photos and recordings captured the night's events in vivid detail, ensuring that the story would reach far beyond their neighborhood. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Ezra stood on the community center steps, watching as neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Their smiles and waves carried a new sense of hope, a belief that the darkness that had gripped their lives was finally lifting. Camille joined him, her notebook in hand. "You did it, Ezra," she said softly. "We did it." Ezra nodded, his expression thoughtful. "This is just the beginning. Now we rebuild." As the neighborhood came alive with the promise of a new day, Ezra felt a deep sense of pride. He hadn't just defended his community, he had helped them rediscover their strength. A new dawn. The morning air carried a sense of renewal as the first light of dawn illuminated the streets. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for months seemed to dissipate overnight. For the first time in years, there was hope, a fragile but tangible belief that things were changing for the better. Ezra Monroe stood by his hot dog cart on the corner of Pine and 3rd, his usual spot. But today was different. Today, the air felt lighter, the smiles of his customers a little brighter. The events of the past weeks had transformed the community, and though the fight was not entirely over, they had taken a decisive step toward reclaiming their home. "Morning, Ezra," Sarah, the florist from down the block, greeted as she approached the cart. "You must feel like a hero." Ezra chuckled softly, handing her a steaming sausage on a bun. "A hero? Nah, just doing what needed to be done." She smiled warmly, her eyes glistening. "You've given us all something we haven't felt in a long time, hope." As Sarah walked away, Ezra noticed Camille approaching. Her ever-present notebook was tucked under one arm, and her camera hung from her shoulder. She wore a look of satisfaction, tempered with determination. "Ezra," she said, setting her notebook on the cart. "The story's out. The city knows what Hendrik's been doing." Ezra tilted his head. And it's already making waves," Camille replied. "Hart's team is pressing charges, and with Bulldog's crew in custody, the case against Hendrik is solid. The court date's set for next month." Ezra nodded, his gaze drifting to the street around him. Businesses were opening, kids were laughing, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth. It was a stark contrast to the fear and mistrust that had plagued the area before. "But it's not over," Ezra said quietly, his voice steady. "Hendrik might be going down, but the damage he caused won't disappear overnight." Camille leaned on the cart, her expression serious. "You're right. That's why we need to keep the momentum going. The fight doesn't stop with him. It's about rebuilding and making sure no one else tries to pull the same stunt." Ezra smiled faintly. "You're wise beyond your years, Camille." Later that day, a community meeting was held at the newly restored community center. The vandalism had been cleaned up, the graffiti painted over, and the once intimidating space now felt welcoming again. The room was packed, every seat filled with neighbors eager to discuss the future. Ezra stood at the front, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he addressed the crowd. "We've been through a lot," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We've faced fear, intimidation, and loss, but we stood together. And because of that, we're stronger." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces filled with respect and admiration for the man who had led them through the storm. "But strength isn't enough," Ezra continued. "We need to stay vigilant. We need to keep supporting each other, rebuilding what's been lost, and holding anyone who tries to harm this community accountable." A hand shot up in the audience. It was Marcus, the young mechanic whose shop had been targeted. "What's the plan, Ezra? How do we make sure this never happens again?" Ezra smiled. "We organize. We create a neighborhood watch, hold regular meetings, and build connections with each other. We let the city know we're not just a collection of people, we're a community. And we won't be pushed around." The room erupted in applause, a tangible sense of empowerment filling the space. Camille stepped forward, her camera slung over her shoulder. "And we document everything," she added. "If someone tries to exploit us, we shine a light on it. No more shadows." Ezra nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Exactly. Together, We're unstoppable. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood transformed. The community center became a hub of activity, hosting workshops, events, and meetings. Local businesses rebounded, supported by a network of neighbors who refused to let anyone fall behind. Camille's articles continued to expose the corruption Hendrik had spread beyond their neighborhood, igniting similar movements in other parts of the city. Her work earned national attention, and she became a respected voice for grassroots change. Officer Hart, true to his word, maintained a visible police presence, ensuring the neighborhood felt secure. But he also went beyond the badge, participating in meetings and getting to know the community on a personal level. As for Ezra, he became more than a local legend. He became a symbol of resilience. People from all walks of life visited his hot dog cart, not just for the food but for the wisdom he shared. One afternoon, as Ezra was closing up his cart, Ronnie approached. The young man looked healthier, more confident than Ezra had ever seen him. He held a small paper bag in his hands. "Mr. Monroe," Ronnie began, his voice steady but laced with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And because of you, I'm turning my life around." Ezra smiled, patting the young man on the shoulder. "You did the hard part, Ronnie. You chose to change. That takes courage." Ronnie handed him the bag. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have this." Inside was a small figurine carved from wood, depicting a boxer in a fighting stance. Ezra studied it, his eyes softening. "It's perfect," he said. "Thank you." As Ronnie walked away, Ezra placed the figurine on the counter of his cart. It stood as a reminder of what they had all fought for, a symbol of the indomitable spirit of a community that refused to back down. On a warm spring morning, months after Hendrik's conviction, Ezra sat on his favorite bench in the park. The pond shimmered in the sunlight, and children's laughter echoed through the air. He opened his notebook, jotting down a few words of wisdom to share with his customers. "Life's about timing," he wrote. "Know when to jab, when to dodge, and when to stand your ground." As he closed the notebook, Camille appeared, her camera in hand. She sat beside him, her smile bright. "You did it, Ezra," she said softly. He chuckled. "We did it." Together, they looked out at the park, the neighborhood, and the community they had fought to protect. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And they would keep fighting, one day at a time, to keep it that way. The storm had passed, and a new dawn had arrived.